Hi, everyone. This week we're joined by the writer and community builder Anna Savina to discuss preppers and prepper aesthetics. We've prepared a Pinterest board on the later that we're going to include in the episode description. And as you'll see, there's a diverse spectrum of prepper aesthetics that demonstrate how different social classes have mitigated their fears of the apocalypse through consumerism. Anna previously published a zine on bunkers and reached out to us about doing an episode. And this topic happens to be a really nice companion to the episode we recently did on nuclear energy discourse. And now Joseph's going to introduce Anna to our listeners. And I'm actually interested because we actually haven't met before. Unlike a lot of other guests, you along with Zambel on the C-Punk 2 episode, you're new to us. So I'm curious to learn a bit more about your background.
Yeah, I'm really excited.
I work in tech, and I've been living in San Francisco for about 7 years now. And as I was spending the pandemic in San Francisco, I got really interested in prepper aesthetics. But I've been a writer for a really long time. I used to work for one of the biggest Russian independent publications when I still lived in Moscow. And it was kind of a Vice, BuzzFeed mix in 2012, 2013, but was more focused on tech. And I was reporting tech and design and interviewing a lot of contemporary artists, interviewing a lot of tech people. So I was always interested in kind of tech aesthetics and how tech elites are signaling their wealth. So yeah, that's what I've been exploring. And I still have a newsletter. I don't work as a journalist anymore, but I have a newsletter and I'm writing a lot about aesthetics and culture and design and tech.
All right. So you used to work more as a journalist and now you've pivoted back into actually working in the tech field. But it seems like you still have the itch, so you still want to get your writings out there and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I started as a reporter working for this big independent publication when I was in my early 20s. And about 7 years ago, I started working in tech and building user communities for tech companies and working in events, running blogs for tech companies. So I still love writing, and I still do a fair amount of writing for my newsletter.
Yeah. And so kind of what we used to start off this episode was the article from you that you had published in a zine. What was the kind of origins of that article?
Yeah, totally. So the origin of this project is I have an amazing collaborator, Ksenia Samarskaya. She's a talented type designer, and she worked with a lot of big brands like Apple and some tech companies. And we, in the beginning of the pandemic, we were both kind of thinking about some research projects we can do together or something we can write about together. And at the time, even before the pandemic, I had a friend from Wisconsin, actually. He was really interested in preppers, but also his own parents were preppers and lived in almost like a bunker somewhere in Wisconsin. And
very off-grid.
And I met him early in 2020. I was really fascinated by that because I didn't know much about it, but I really liked Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, and I thought it was kind of hilarious, and that's how I imagined this friend's life in their childhood. And but then the pandemic started, and I was really shocked to see how people reacted, how people were buying, stockpiling food and stuff like that, and thinking about there were so many articles and news pieces about bunkers or millionaires building bunkers in New Zealand or something else. And I was really fascinated because it was such an outdated Cold War reaction. It was from the Cold War. The reaction was very weird for 2020. And I was really, both me and my friend, Ksenia, who designed this zine, we were both really fascinated by that. And that's why we started exploring it and started looking for really good references. And that's how I discovered some of the articles that we're going to discuss today, like Daniel Barber's piece in eFlex or some others. And I think, that's how this zine was created.
Did she do the graphic design for it?
Yeah, she did. Yeah.
It's very good. I don't know. It was very crisp. I really liked it. It made it a lot more, interesting to read and engaging. But yeah. And also, how did you find out about our podcast?
I think I found you guys through Nymphet alumni or something like that. I'm a big fan of Nymphet alumni, and I really like all this like cultural, I think the explorations that they do of different aesthetics. And I realized you were doing also kind of a different angle on that, and I really loved your urban design angle, because I think when I was a reporter, I was also writing a lot about architecture, interviewing architects and urban planners as well, and obviously bunkers and the Cold War aesthetics. It's kind of connected to weird vision of a city, or maybe
or a post city
a weird
or
vision.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did take a lot of inspiration from Nymphet alumni, but there are absolutely unofficial sister podcasts. They have nothing to do with us.
Yeah, no, they don't even know we exist, I don't think.
They don't know we exist yet, but I mean, hopefully one day they do. But yeah. Do you have a favorite episode of our podcast, by the way?
I really love the department stores one. I was thinking a lot about department stores recently as well, because again, with COVID, like everything moved online, and there are like very few good department stores. And in San Francisco, it's always like such a big drama with all the stores leaving downtown and closing department stores. And I was really, I really loved that one. I think it was really, really cool.
Yeah. I think the one we're about to do next week will be pretty similar. We're about to do one on movie theaters.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's going to have a similar vibe, I think, because we're going to be talking about it from a Chicago lens quite a bit.
Yeah, it's something that like department stores predates the era of the car, but was fundamentally changed by it as well. So but yeah.
Now we can actually get into the topic of preppers. So I was like way less familiar with this topic than a lot of the other ones that we've talked about so far on our podcast. And so for me, it was important to just get some like basic terms under my belt and understand what a prepper was. And in the process, I sort of realized that preppers have a lot of subtypes in a similar way that we discovered when doing research for the hobos episode. So to jog people's memory, hobos, there are different types. There are hobos, tramps, and bums. So hobos travel and work. Tramps do not work, but do travel. And then bums don't travel or work. And so with preppers, there are three subtypes that I think are the big ones, but there are a couple of other smaller ones that I'm sure you guys read about too.
But there are like modifications of each type, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, there are preppers, survivalists, and also doomsday preppers. I think those are the three big ones. So we should talk about those a little bit and define them.
I think there are a lot of different subcultures or versions of it. And I think survivalists especially are very different, because I feel like preppers, it's more about technology and more about building some kind of safe space or building an exit strategy. And survivalism, at least the way I'm typically seeing it, it's more about the skills and like surviving in the wilderness and building shelter from scratch or something like that. So I think that's a really big distinction there.
Yeah. I see there as being kind of like four components to prepping, I guess. You have supplies, you have skills, you have apparel, which you could maybe put under supplies.
Yeah.
And then you have like a place, basically. And so I think everyone can fit in different places kind of on this square here. But
to give a basic definition of a prepper that I found from their Survival Frog blog, they're a person who values emergency preparedness and actively plans ahead for disasters and SHTF situations by stockpiling skills and supplies like food, water, and gear. But I think it's like definitely emphasizing the stockpiling part. It's very consumerist. It's very much like I can buy my way into comfort and safety.
Yeah.
Whereas for survivalists, it's like my knowledge is what's going to give me safety in the event of an SHTF scenario.
we should also say that SHTF is shit hits the fan.
Yeah,
basically.
Which is important for you to say because I can't say it.
Yeah, he doesn't curse.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'm useful in that way.
Got it.
But yeah, and then a subvariant of the prepper is the doomsday prepper. So that's someone who believes the end of the world is fast approaching. And then within that, I think there's like a whole bunch of different directions of there's the more religious doomsday people, and there's people who have a specific disaster in mind, and there's just kind of, I'd say, a vague general doomsday prepper, like something's going to happen. We don't know what it's going to be, but they want to be prepared for it.
Yeah, I think that preppers, they think that SHGF scenarios can happen that aren't just the apocalypse. It could be a wildfire or an earthquake. It could be supply chain collapse. Something, things that aren't as permanent. But yeah, the doomsday prepper, it's like very much like a one and done deal. Once things start to unravel, there's no society that's going to come back.
Yeah. I think that it seems like there's a lot of gatekeeping and like hierarchies in prepping a bit. I think survivalists see themselves as better than like stockpiling style preppers. And I kind of get their appeal there because you're building skills. It's not a thing you can purchase. You have to actually do it. So I kind of get their angle there.
Yeah, there's a good meme I found that shows the difference.
Yeah. It's kind of taking the format of like the Chad versus Virgin memes where like survivalists see themselves as like these masculine developing things. And then they see, the prepper is just someone capable of buying a lot of beans at one time. But yeah, I think it's also like people who invest more of their lifestyle and give more up for prepping want to feel justified and vindicated. If you have a whole room in your house that you could have used as an office or a nursery, but instead it's just like wire mesh shelves full of supplies, like if you either confront the fact that you're giving something up or you have to like, say like, no, this means I'm higher up in the hierarchy of survival.
Yeah. You know what that just made me think of? This is probably the lowest form of prepper, but it's the like couponer, which have either of you ever seen Here Comes Honey Boo Boo on TLC?
No, I have not.
TLC is like the trashiest reality TV show channel, and one of their shows was Toddlers and Tiaras. And then they had this little girl on the show who was so wild that she got her a whole own show called Here Comes Honey Boo Boo. But anyways, her mom doesn't do anything like the whole show, but her skill is like couponing, and her house is just filled with like Walmart goods. But yeah, I feel like couponers can be construed as being preppers in a way, but it's more so just that they like the comfort of like having lots of material goods on hand. So they're not thinking about SHGF or the apocalypse as much.
Yeah. I think I'll touch on that later when I get to talk about Mormons and stuff, but it's all it's a very American thing, I think, because of the generous sizes of our homes. I think we have this, horror vacui is the desire to fill an empty space. And so if you can't fill it with like life in any way, you can fill it with like anticipatory kind of purchases and possessions.
Yeah.
And I think there are also a lot of, when we think about preppers, there are like right-wing preppers and there are liberal preppers, and some of them are like gun enthusiasts, some of them are really against guns. So I think it just covers a really wide political spectrum, and also I feel like there are some subcultures that are adjacent to preppers, like homesteading and even ballerina farm, or like all these TikTokers that are
tradwife
doing videos,
content.
Tradwife and homesteading. When I was interviewing different experts for my article, I found this one guy who wrote a book about his time interviewing real preppers across the US, and he said that a lot of people also see sometimes it being like a part of the prepper subculture help them connect with people. For example, if they're right wing, connect with liberal people, or connect with people who maybe don't share their political beliefs. And like some people see a lot of value in like the way this shared goal is creating a community for them. So
it's bringing people together. I was really going to assume the opposite, like the existence of groups like Common Sense Approach to Preparedness and Survival. Is that a more liberal leaning group, that one, or is that just kind of generally centrist, would you say?
I think it's generally centrist.
Okay, but for those more liberal groups, what their existence signaled to me was that like even if people are looking for information and supplies for the end of the world, they're still not willing to meet with people on the opposite side of the political spectrum. That's how I read that as. But the fact that people have actually reported that, like, you know, we all imagine that the end of the world would bring people closer together. Maybe we don't all imagine that, but it looks like even the anticipation of the end of the world can start to bring people together a bit. It's a lot more optimistic than I thought we were going to be on this, but
yeah, totally.
Yeah. One type of prepper subculture I think is more left leaning is like the urban farming movement, which I don't think comes out of like them thinking there's going to be like an SHGF apocalypse either. It's just maybe that they want to reclaim like farming and agrarianism from just rural lifestyles. Like they want to, you know, have that power too in a way, but it's also fun. People just like gardening.
Yeah.
And then I think there's one other term that's like helpful to define for people, and that one's bug out bag.
Yeah, so this feels like the kind of minimum effective dose of disaster preparedness. This is just like a bag or a system of bags that has everything you need to leave and be prepared for a like shit hits the fan situation. I think this is a lot lower of a barrier of entry than, you know, having a whole room in your house dedicated to something. Anyone can have a duffel bag and fill it with stuff that you buy from REI or other cheaper outdoor supply places. And I think it lets renters participate in the prepper fantasy as well. Like you can't really make modifications to your home. You can't line your walls with concrete if you live in a, you know, multi-unit apartment building, but you can have your bug out bag. And also people linguistically talk about bugging in or bugging out. So bugging in is staying in place with all your prepared stuff. And then bugging out is like going on the road and traveling. And so that would be like in a natural disaster scenario, you'd probably leave. But then in a, I don't know, unrest thing, maybe you'd hunker down. I don't know exactly.
Yeah. I myself, I have a bug out bag to a degree. So every day I run around the city in like a cross shoulder bag, which yes, looks like a fanny pack. And inside of it, I do carry like a pocket knife, a tourniquet, and Narcan, all of which I hope not to use. Although I do use the knife actually for random things all the time. It's like actually helpful to have. Yeah. But yeah, I do not take opioids, but yeah, I work in a library where people could theoretically overdose any day, and it's just helpful to have.
Totally. Yeah. I think, I mean, living in San Francisco as well, people don't talk about it too much, but of course there are everyone, the minute they move to San Francisco, they read this New York article about the big one and how it's coming and how it's going to be so bad in San Francisco. So I have a bag like that. A lot of people have it, and it's like a $10 Amazon thing. It's like a perfect example of like how it's getting commodified, because of course you can pay so much more and get so much more
luxurious
variety or
bag.
like a higher quality products or something like that. So yeah, that's definitely a great example of how it's working
my
together.
grandfather, when he was 4 years old, was actually in the Great San Francisco earthquake, and he didn't have. I mean, after the earthquake happened, he couldn't find his shoes, so he had to walk around the city in broken glass for like I don't know how long. But then after that, the rest of his life, he always slept next to his bed with shoes, like next to his bed, just in case that ever happened again.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and I actually, when I just moved to San Francisco, I lived in this building that survived the earthquake, and it was one of very few buildings on Haight Street that was built before 1906, which was really cool because it was a historic landmark, and I really loved. It made me feel very safe, of course, that it survived the 1906 earthquake.
Yeah. And then next, I think something we should get into is the zine that you made a little bit more on bunkers. And we can use this to talk about bunkers more broadly. And so I really love what you put together. It's a very aesthetically beautiful zine. But I do want to start out with one little criticism. So basically, you said that in the zine that bunkers are a fairly recent creation or invention. But I think that you can actually find examples going very far back where people had different fears of annihilation, of structures that they made that like help them mitigate those fears. Castles are a good example, but I think even more so, in Italian medieval cities and into the Renaissance, wealthy families would build these really tall towers most of which were cut down when the Italian city-states were conquering each other. So, for example, when Florence conquered Siena, they cut down all of their towers except for one that's in the center of the city in the Palazzo Pubblico. But there is one example that this one very small city where like most of the towers were left called San Gimignano, which I'll put a link to in the show notes so people can see it. But Italian families that had money, they would build these really tall towers in the case of a siege so that they could stay inside and insulate themselves, and they would like have food and water and hopefully stay there for a few weeks until all the chaos passed. And so I think this is an example of like
vertical bunkers.
Yeah, it's a vertical bunker. It's like sort of it's the opposite in terms of architecture, but it's fulfilling the same need.
Yeah. And these came out of periods of strife as well, but it was like a low grade, like city state against city state strife, as opposed to like global nuclear war that gave birth to our like current era of bunkers that we live in and the kind of language of bunkers that we work with as well.
Yeah.
No. I think it's a really good addition to my research, because I think what made bunkers so feel so new to me, I think because it was a solution that was created when there was like a real nuclear threat. And I think it's, in a way, it's a little bit different from other structures that would protect people from, outside, maybe from people from like an army or from natural disasters. I think it's also really connected to biosphere too, and to all these experiments, mid-century experiments in creating an autonomous system or autonomous living unit. And I think this parallel with like a spaceship, I think what I really like to compare bunkers to, it's in a way, it's a spaceship. It's an effort in creating a totally autonomous shelter. And I think in that way, you're right, because there are parallels with, of course, with like a tower that would protect someone during the war or like under a siege. But at the same time, it felt very new and very mid-century.
Modern.
It was very modern and very informed by technology.
Yeah. No, the spaceship Earth like phrase, that is something that came out of the 60s, and it was this like change in, I think, as we went to space, we started to view ourselves as like, a planet like traveling through space in a way. Yes, it's in an orbit, but if you think about it, like we have everything we need aboard this spaceship, and so we kept on trying to shrink that unit smaller and smaller, and that's where like Biosphere 2 comes in. We're wondering like how small can we make the unit of a spaceship, basically. And I guess a bunker is like a spaceship that's supposed to safely take you through an inhospitable period by standing still. Like where a spaceship could take you through the inhospitability of space to somewhere else habitable, a bunker just waits it out. It kind of just moves in time. I don't know, kind of like Planet of the Apes, where they, in that movie, like they think that they've traveled far in space, but they've only traveled far in time. We can cut that out. I think that was a little banal of me, maybe.
No, I think that goes into the quote that Anna included from Daniel Barber, if you wanted to read that.
Yeah, totally. I was about to say, I think your comparison to a tower also is very interesting, because Daniel Barber, he's a professor of architecture at the University of Technology in Sydney, and he wrote this amazing piece about exit strategies and like the role of exits in like architecture, but also in kind of our daily life right now. So this is the quote. The bunker becomes the conceptual framework for the continuity of daily life. If people are anxious about climate disruption, they're going to have all their emergency kits or even a place to go, and that becomes a permission structure. And when I was writing my article, I was really interested in this idea of permission structure, because the way Daniel Barber describes it and the way it can be applied to bunkers as well is like, as long as we have this bunker as a permission structure that maybe can contain all our anxiety around climate change, or can contain our anxiety about, the destruction of oceans and potential nuclear collapse or some other catastrophe, I think that's kind of like a perfect object for people to just focus on and to like build towards having all these survivalist kits, or like building a bunker or building something inside your home. that kind of allows all the destruction that is happening everywhere to continue. And I think that was a really good metaphor, and from like a conversation around skyscrapers and how skyscrapers became popular starting in 1930s. I think that that's a really great parallel that I was thinking a lot about when I was writing my article.
Yeah, that his comparison to skyscrapers really got me thinking. Like his kind of, I hope I'm not mangling this, but his idea is that like what has allowed skyscrapers to get taller is a kind of shifting of risk, or an insurance management of risk. You know, like when you build a building above 100 feet or so, like you're now outside the reach of firefighters' ladders, and so you're fully reliant on emergency exits, and this whole like a larger and larger system develops as you go taller and taller to just safely get people out of it. And you realize that like for a long time, the tallest structures were antennas, things that didn't require humans on them. But we've recently the Burj Khalifa is the tallest structure in the world, and it's actually meant to carry people. And so it's even more difficult because it's constrained by people, you know. Like it's just like nuclear submarines. The limit on their performance is not, you know, nuclear power. The limit is human, like food needs and all that. That is how long a nuclear submarine can be out at sea. And so the height of our buildings feels constrained by, in the event of an emergency, how can you safely get everyone down? You know, you'd think the limit to a height of a building would be structural or at least economic, maybe. But really, it's our risk tolerance.
Yeah, and in his article, I think he mentioned a movie called, was it The Tower or The Skyscraper?
Yeah, it's a Dwayne The Rock Johnson movie. Yeah, it's like kind of, I read the Wikipedia blurb for this. It's like a skyscraper in
Hong Kong.
In Hong Kong, yeah. But it's like very styled after like the Burj Khalifa, but with like it's like holding a pearl, basically. And then he is like a grizzled security veteran who's lost his foot in the past. And so he has to like save the tower because that's his job. But then also his daughter has been kidnapped and she's in danger.
Yeah. It sounded like a cool movie based off of how it was described in the article, but I'm sure I'm never going to watch it. But no, I do think that there's like so many things that people have to consider with like fire codes that, to me, as like someone who wants people to be able to build like 4-story buildings, it's like, come on, like please just, it's not important. But yeah, if you're building up that high, things can go really wrong. Like I think, what was the fire that happened in London? It was like the Grenfell Tower disaster.
Yeah, Grenfell Towers. Yeah.
Okay.
It was like a public housing project.
That was so sad when it happened.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I feel like, well, there is an argument to be made that like our skyscrapers are pushing the limits of safety, possibly. We've taken that high level of safety and we've applied it to very small buildings in our everyday life. So in that way, I think it's kind of the reverse. I think that we've like the concept of insurance has kind of squeezed a lot of perfectly safe to a reasonable degree. I think we've let perfect be the enemy of good when it comes to safety and design. Like we build our everyday apartment buildings as if they're like industrial hotels. We have these double loaded corridors. We have 2 large stairwells and their sizes are very governed, connected by a hallway. And that size is very large and governed as well. And then the whole building, if it's above 5 stories, must be sprinkled too. And then it must be made of non-combustible materials. These are all different ways to achieve safety. Europe just kind of puts all of its money into just fire safe materials. You just do that for even short buildings.
Yeah.
In America, we have that for taller buildings, but we overlap extensively our safety structures until it's too onerous for people to build things. Yeah, that's such a strange aside, I feel, from bunkers. But I don't know. I think it kind of connects.
No, it ties in. I mean, I don't think I would have ever come up with this idea about like exit strategies and skyscrapers. But when I was reading your zine, you kept going back to that idea quite a bit. So yeah, from your perspective, bunkers are an exit strategy.
Yeah, totally. I think with all the conversations around commercial space travel and things like that, it also feels like, I think another way to put it is it feels like a coping mechanism that people use, like both with space travel or building bunkers or, you know, trying to seek these methods that would be like, that are so technology enabled, but don't really propose like a bigger vision for like what sustainability can look like in the future. I think it's just like a coping mechanism that, again, like I think people are creating all this, I don't know, 7-story bunkers in Kansas that have like that has like a pool and everything, because it's so all consuming to build something like this. And of course, it's when you don't have a lot of control over like bigger changes in the world, or like even if you don't have like certainties that you can make an impact, of course, like a project like that can take all your time and really work as this coping mechanism to deal with the news and kind of a feeling of that, a feeling of being like out of control.
Yeah. It's a way to kind of inflict control upon this little like sphere of our life, you know, making a payment down on a bunker or something, or having your bug out bag. I guess it lets you have a continuity, like live your daily life the same, but just knowing that you have this other option. Yeah. And kind of circling back to that like skyscraper thing, he mentions in that article this one project where like the emergency air supply of a system, the architect covered it in like gold foil or something to make it more highlighted, and to take this like very quiet background thing and make it very obvious for people that like the reason this whole building can exist is because like we have things ready in case it all goes bad. Like usually buildings try and obfuscate and hide those things. They definitely never try and highlight them.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I don't think that bunkers necessarily had to be treated as like an exit strategy. I think that they're a good idea to have, you know, in a lot of different scenarios, but the idea of them being an exit strategy came from, as you mentioned in your zine, the US putting it on individual people, citizens, to create safety for themselves, because we weren't able, or at least in our economic model, to create bunkers for the majority of citizens. John F. Kennedy left it on Americans to do it for themselves. And I think that other countries took a different strategy. You know, Russia and other countries in the USSR, they built subway systems that were explicitly meant to serve as bunkers, like the deep sections of, actually, you might be able to say this better than me because I think you speak Russian, right? Arbatsko Pokrovsky, sorry.
Yeah, it's Arbatske. It's a station that is, it's very deep.
It was meant to serve as a bunker. Worked.
Yeah. I think during the World War II, it was definitely used for like shelter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it feels like America will do anything besides build subways post World War II. You know, like, even if it was going to help, even if it was going to like also help our like nuclear war preparedness effort, we would not do anything to take away from the automobile at the time. Yeah. Another country in opposition to the American thing is, but entirely different set of circumstances, is Switzerland is extremely prepared for any kind of nuclear event, in terms of they have 9.3 million bunker spots for 8.7 million citizens. Wow. Yeah, they like voted as a citizenry to fund this in 1959. And also, if you know anything about suffrage in Switzerland, you know that would have been entirely men voting for that, because women weren't allowed to vote until 1971, which I always thought was bizarre for like a Western country, like next to all the other ones. But yeah, it seems like they had an easy situation because I think they have a lot of mountains to bury into, basically, and they have a more condensed population. But I think they also have the cultural just decision making. If they just held a referendum and everyone voted for it, I don't think it's hard for America to mobilize anything behind anything besides a war. I think we're much better at mobilizing for the offensive part of defense, not really the defensive part of defense.
It's very true.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting with bunkers in the US. I feel like it's really connected to, single family housing, and kind of thinking about also the implications of one of the people I interviewed was the scholar, and I think she did a research about survivalism and gender norms and feminism. And I think she was talking about the way bunkers were reinforcing like a kind of patriarchal structure, and just a single family protecting itself from the outside world. And really, I think, of course, this isolation can create a lot of really difficult dynamics. And I think it's also a very interesting point of view here, because there is no communal space. It's so focused on a single family, or maybe if it's like a huge bunker in Kansas that we add to a Pinterest board, maybe it's like still a very small group of people, maybe several families working together. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think she used the term man cave when describing bunkers.
Yeah. It's like, I think it's definitely like a power and control thing. It kind of reminds me of this movie from 2011, Take Shelter. So it's got Michael Shannon in it, if you know that actor. And I forget when it takes place. It's like in 50s to 70s. But he's this guy who just has this idea that there's a great tornado coming, so he needs to protect his family. And so he starts to build this bunker kind of to the confusion of everyone around him, because there's nothing on the radar about this happening. But yeah, and I think it's like played as a way of like, this is a man who, even though things seem to be going well, feels as though he's losing control of his family. And this is a way to like close, hermetically seal everything off, and just kind of like recreate a situation where you actually have control over things. Yeah, I think that's, definitely a fantasy of some preppers is like, finally someday I'll be right and everyone will have to listen to me and come to me for supplies. Yeah, the masculine angle to this is, it kind of reminds me of like divorced dadcore movies, which is Taken and Mr. Nobody, which is about like a beleaguered father who everyone kind of takes advantage of or doesn't appreciate, but then some crazy situation happens and his knowledge and his skills and his preparedness like come into need, and everyone has to apologize to him and show how like correct and competent he is. I think that plays into the fantasy for a lot of men who prep.
Those movies sound like a country song.
Yeah. This, the feeling you get when you listen to a country song. It's just like that you were right the whole time. It was everyone else who was wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the podcast that you guys recommended about where the hosts talk about why they are so excited about the end of the world, and like why they even got into being preppers and into like acquiring survivalist skills. I think when they talk about their hobby and why they think it matters, it's all also very like, it's very straight male perspective of like a like a patriarch, and they're talking a lot about their family and how they
a man provides.
Yeah, they basically have the same fantasy of really being valued after something really bad happens, and them like finally applying all these skills. Yeah,
I think it's a good impulse generally. Like, I think it is like a way that a lot of guys feel validation is by providing for people. I think it's one of those things of like, I don't know, people say like, since men can't have kids, we're like searching for these other things to like validate and like kind of get close to feeling like we create things. And if you can't create something, you can at least protect it. So I get where that's coming from. And maybe there's not enough real things for men to protect the people in their lives from, that we need to invent things. Basically. There's also, back when I used to be more like into this world and like reading about guns and stuff, there's really weird guys online who'd be in this thing called sheepdogging, where you'd just concealed carry a gun and you'd go out and you just kind of hope for bad situations to happen so you can protect people. So these are guys, I was saying earlier about like, guys who have people to protect, but nothing bad is happening. These are guys who have no one to protect, but they still want to protect people. They also have nothing bad happening either, but they're looking for it as well. Like, these are people with a strong protection instinct and no vessel for it, basically. So
yeah, that's like Curtis Silwai's organization, the Angels, right?
Oh.
Or the Guardians. The Red Berets. They're the like people in New York City, and we have them too in Chicago. They have Red Berets and will patrol the public, and police don't actually really like them. But they just, I'll see them on the bus sometimes, occasionally, like they're watching other people, making sure people are safe. But it's similar to that. We'll get into the podcast though later, a little farther down. Before we get into that, I do want to sort of address how some themes you brought up in the zine around how bunkers emerge in response to fears of a nuclear Armageddon and the nuclear arms race. And how we can tie that into just sort of some things that we talked about in the nuclear energy discourse episode. So you mentioned in your zine that in 1961, in the wake of the Berlin crisis, President Kennedy appeared on TV and said that the government had to tell citizens where they should go if bombs begin to fall. And soon after, there was a solution. In September 1961, Life magazine published an issue with a man in a civilian fallout suit on the cover. And so bunkers and preppers entered public consciousness before nuclear energy ever did. So the first nuclear reactor, large scale, that was built in the US, it only started construction in 1968. So this was like bunkers and nuclear fallout suits. People were thinking about these before nuclear reactors were built in their states or their backyards. And I think that this fear maybe could have been better mitigated if it wasn't put on individual people's shoulders. If it was, the government taking responsibility to build people bunkers, or if it just meant that individual people were caring more about who they elected to avoid nuclear war. Mm-hmm. Because,
it just feels like, the government was saying like, all right, we spent all this money to develop nuclear weapons. Now the whole world has them, and it's actually your responsibility to protect yourself from them. So it's like we ushered in the nuclear age. The federal government ushered in the nuclear age and then asked everyone else to deal with the consequences of it. And this must have been so scary because this is coming hot off of a period where in the Great Depression, the federal government had largely expanded its scope and was doing things it had never taken the responsibility of before. It was building Hoover Dam. It was like putting artists to work. And it expanded even like non-physical infrastructure, if you think of stuff like Social Security. And then it won a world war as well. So it seems like it can do anything. And then it builds a federal highway system. And it says the one thing we can't do is protect you from a nuclear war. So that must make it feel like the scariest thing in the world if it's outside the limits of like this newly dominant American federal system.
Yeah.
I think it's also the issue of Life magazine that was from 1961. They have all this like scary, like step-by-step instructions about making your own makeshift bunker. And I can't imagine how scary it must be. But then, of course, there were like Amway bunkers that you can order from a catalog almost right away. And it was like a big market category to introduce to people. It feels very surreal with starting with the instructions and kind of like individual responsibility. And then, of course, it became a commodity, and it was like a kind of a part of things that you can order from Amway catalog.
Yeah, and I think what the U.S. government did by putting the responsibility to be prepared for nuclear war on the shoulders of everyday Americans, I think it contributed to the shift that Naomi Klein pointed out in her book on consumers versus citizens, where basically Americans no longer view themselves as citizens. We view ourselves as consumers. And this is the perfect example, basically, where instead of relying on the government, people then just consumed bunkers that would make them feel more safe. And it's just consumer culture.
Yeah,
totally.
And then we should probably get into prepper aesthetics next. So before starting my research, I assumed that like prepper aesthetics were very sleek and high tech, similar to what you included in your images of bunkers in your zine, Anna. I assumed that bunkers and prepper culture had the same aesthetic and quality of like REI goods. But then I found in reality, no.
It breaks down on class lines.
It breaks down on class lines. So it's important to emphasize that there are prepper aesthetics, plural, because I think that, yes, there's a very luxurious and sleek prepper aesthetic, but generally it's very like DIY, and it's just people stockpiling consumer goods that are from Walmart, and it's not very pretty.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot of canned goods on. I said that earlier, like wire shelves. Everyone seems to have a lot of those, like when it comes to the actual storage of stuff. But in the Pinterest board, I tried to add I looked up like bug out bag inspiration. And it's funny that you can find that on Pinterest, because I always think of Pinterest as being so cute in its general vibe. Like graphic design wise, and also like clientele wise, it's like my mom and everyone else's mom all hanging out on there, looking at like bug out bag inspiration and stuff for the end of the world. But yeah, and it'll just be like regular camping gear, but arranged in such a way that it just seems less fun. Like camping is fun, but then you can take the same gear and recontextualize it under like, oh, this is my stuff in case, the contract of society breaks down and people want to kill me. And so a hatchet that would be for like cutting down a tree for firewood is also for killing someone in that situation. But yeah.
Yeah. In your own research, Anna, like, what do you think is like the dominant prepper aesthetic?
I think Walmart is definitely Walmart aesthetic is definitely very popular. I think there is also like a kind of clickbait quality to a lot of it, because I think especially around like 2020 there were all these articles about, oh, look at this like 7-story luxurious bunker in New Zealand where Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are gonna live. And I think it's a totally different aspirational part of it, and kind of an aspirational aesthetic of like a, I don't know, an airport or a hotel, like a Middle Eastern mall. Everything's very sleek and
clean,
it's
all your
probably
comforts
happening in
are here.
Dubai. Yeah. Maybe happening in Dubai. So I think there is definitely a divide, because what different news outlets are emphasizing is definitely like a class divide and like a weird architectural aspect of it. But of course, everyday aesthetic is very DIY and kind of ugly.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's a very noticeable distinction. And of course, I think for survivalism, it's also a different aesthetic, because it's more about wilderness and it's not as technology dependent.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two ways you can do outdoor aesthetics, even outside of survivalism and stuff. And there's the REI way. There's kind of the Bass Pro Shops way. I don't know if you've ever been to a Bass Pro Shops or what's the other? It's like the same company, Cabela's Hunting Outfitters. Like these are both like stores that you would think would sell similar things, but they're done in a right wing and a left wing kind of way. Do we want to hop into the quick discussion on like the e-bikes and stuff, or do you want to wait to get into talking about that podcast, the Casual Preppers podcast?
I still want to wait on that.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, it's interesting to bring up the divides again. So I don't think there are too many like sort of generalizations you can make about preppers, but I do think that like one thing you can say is like it's largely like a lower middle class or like an upper class phenomenon. I think though that like in order to successfully do it, you do need like quite a lot of capital, as you brought up in your zine. You know, people are struggling to afford their primary residence, to have to buy a residence that you might use in case of emergency on top of that is like a big ask that very few people can afford. And then another divide I think exists is that if you look at Google Trends, which I looked at preppers on Google Trends for this podcast, and you can see like what states are most popular for preppers, or the people who Google preppers the most. And they are Alaska, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and Oklahoma. But yeah, no surprise. These are some of the most rural like states in the country. And so it's largely a rural phenomenon. And then the states where like, or the term preppers is Googled the least are like New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Maryland, and California. And crazy that New Jersey is the least, because that is that is the state with the highest population density. It's like, what a coincidence.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. And then before we go into the podcast that we all seem to listen to, I listened to another one a little bit, and it's called the Survivalist Prepper Podcast. And I briefly listened to episode 407, where they mentioned that prepper conventions always happen several miles inland. They said that there aren't any conventions on the East Coast. It seems to be more of a rural phenomenon.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think that makes kind of intuitive sense. These are like the sparsely populated rural parts of the country. I went to Wyoming for a paleontology dig once, and I just was so struck by like, oh, they're living the fantasy that a lot of like suburban people think that they're living, you know, when they say like, oh, I just like the open space and the freedom. I couldn't be in an apartment building. I need a single family home. And it's like, yeah, but do you have a propane tank? Are you like completely independent? Like, do you have a septic tank? Do you have like single track roads out to your house? Like for these people, it's very interesting that they think about like the decay of society and government services when they really don't receive a lot of government services already. Like these are in Wyoming, like the highways aren't plowed in the winter, you know, the government just can't like do that. And so it's not done. Yeah. It's just interesting they obsess over it. It would be such a gulf in the style of living if a place like New Jersey collapsed, you know, a place with higher population density and much higher urbanization.
Yeah. And Anna, your friend that you mentioned who lived in Wisconsin, how would you describe their prepper aesthetic?
I think it's very rural, yeah. Yeah, and very DIY. So I think that was, I'm not sure about Wisconsin stats, but it seems like it might be popular as well.
Yeah. It gets very rural up there, more than people would think. But
yeah.
And even the urbanized parts aren't exceptionally urban. If you go to Milwaukee and Madison, like it doesn't scream like, towering big city. They have some like, ugly bank towers from the 60s, but that's about it.
Excuse me, they just built the Couture, which is now the tallest residential building in Wisconsin.
Yeah, look at them. Watch out,
my
Chicago. God. We got to start picking it back up again, or else Milwaukee's going to overtake us.
Yeah. What's funny is our podcast. I love looking at data about our podcast, and so I know like where people are listening from. But Wisconsin is like statistically like. You can tell they see the Chicago flag in our picture, and they're like, "Nah."
Oh man.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a natural impulse that they have.
Yeah. But yeah, I wonder. I started to question like, okay, where did my assumption that like preppers had this like very high tech aesthetic come from? And I realized that like my idea of preppers actually came from this video game that I very recently played called Stranding. Which hopefully we won't talk about too much because I don't think you play video games, right, Anna? No.
I mean, I can play Zelda and stuff like that, but yeah, not Death Stranding.
Yeah. Death Stranding is like really interesting though. It's created by Hideo Kojima, and it's sort of a cult classic already, even though it's only been out a few years, but it has a really bizarre plot that revolves around extinction, and basically there's going to be like a sixth extinction that's about to occur, and the main character is this guy, Sam Porter Bridges, who's played by Norman Reedus, the guy from The Walking Dead, who goes around connecting all of these like cities, but in between the cities, there are these preppers that live in bunkers, and the preppers are like, it turns out that in like the lore of the game, the preppers like began preparing for like living on their own even before the Death Stranding occurred, where there's going to be a sixth extinction. But yeah, there was just like a low trust society. But the game itself has like a very like beautiful aesthetic. On our Pinterest board, if you scroll down to the bottom, those were the first images I added, were pictures from the game. But yeah, Sam and all the other characters in the game, they just are like so like suited up.
Yeah, it's a very like sleek techwear, high concrete modern type of like aesthetic. I think the mechanical parts of it are so like beautiful. There's a lot of exoskeletons and very fine mechanical parts on everything, but it's very like rugged. Like nothing is overly sleek. Everyone's wearing these very rain repellent, like kind of rumpled clothes. It's a lot of things that are kind of like toxic suits or like hazmat suits, basically. And the metals often shine. You can get like a gold pair of glasses. It's just very good design. It's all, the character designer is from Yoji Shinkawa, who had worked on the Metal Gear series, which was Hideo Kojima's like main series before this. And that game is very squarely like military, basically. And Hideo Kojima said when making Death Stranding that like the first thing that man created was a stick to keep things apart. And the second thing he created was a rope to bring things together. And so if Metal Gear was a stick, like all about guns and like shooting people away, he wanted to make a game about bringing things together and connectivity, which is a lot harder from a video game gameplay standpoint. Like there's a reason there's so many gun games. It just like it tracks better of shooting and eliminating things. A game about carrying, gathering, and amassing things is a little trickier. I think you have to work harder on the design. Yeah,
and the gameplay in Death Stranding is literally so bizarre. You're transporting goods like largely on your back across like mountain ranges, and it's basically like being like an Amazon delivery person in a post-apocalyptic setting. But the game is like mostly just walking, and it's really great. It is a good game. But like, yeah.
Yeah. And then so in your article, you linked to a few different just like interesting high design approaches to kind of prepper thinking. The Svalbard seed vault, which is this vault that has a seed of every plant is the general idea of it. It's kind of an arc for like horticulture of human society. And then the entry for it is very just designy. It's raw concrete. It has this like modern approach to stained glass kind of entry. And so it feels like it's in that kind of spaceship approach to human life. Like this is something self-contained that's going to carry us into the future, even if everything becomes inhospitable around it. But then it had like a plumbing leak recently, right? And like almost threatened like its supply, right?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's a pretty famous structure in Norway, I think. And I think you're right that it really looks like a spaceship, but it also kind of looks like a cathedral. And I think it's a very interesting parallel because it has this kind of religious quality that that is like, I think, connected to faith and connected to a belief that something like that can like survive a big event. Yeah, so there is like definitely a faith component, and then there is like a part of it that is just really technological and impressive in that way. So I think
it feels like a future technological religion. I guess thinking about churches and stuff too, those are kind of like, I don't know, a bunker in a sense, but it's to protect the soul from an end time as well, and to carry that soul like a spaceship through.
Right.
And so I had seen that and a lot of other things on like Zine magazine. If you ever read that, it's Dezeen. And they always just have like architecture and design stuff. But I just started noticing like in the early 2010s, like there'd just be all these high fashion or architecture. Like, look at this beautiful bunker. Look at this house that closes up and becomes just like this sealed thing. Oh, but it's also very stark and beautiful on the inside. And there's like an Eames chair. And then there's also the fashion designer, textile artist, or body architect, she calls herself, Lucy McRae, who designs stuff like clothing for the decay of social ties. It's like a bed that hugs you. There's clothing designed for an alienated world where you have like a blinder you put over your face so you don't look at your phone. It's all very social commentary kind of stuff that's like prepared for different types of apocalypse, basically, and you design to that.
Yeah, I think a good word for that is speculative design. It's a term that I learned from one of my professors when I was a student at SAAC, and I took a class with her on the future, or Ways of Futuring, I think was the title of it. But she does her creative practice largely, almost solely in collaboration with her husband. They have a practice called Parsons Charlesworth, and they did this project quite a few years ago at this point called New Survivalism, where they made survival kits that are meant to help people meet their higher level needs on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So survival kits largely only fulfill the most basic needs, food, shelter, water, things like that. But yeah, she would think about like higher level needs. So for example, one of her projects was called The Object Guardian, and it was created for a museum curator who created a ball of miniature iconic objects from the book by the British Museum director Neil McGregor, A History of the World in 100 Objects. So they made this like art crate backpack where 100 small objects were fabricated by the two of them. Really amazing. Another one was created for someone who like had difficulty in the future making decisions. So they had this like jacket filled with things like dice and manuals and books that would help them make decisions in every scenario. But it was a really cool project that I think really does fit into both preppers and this speculative design framework. Because I think that like a lot of things have been done in art and design at this point, and responding to the needs of people in the everyday. People have been doing that, forever. And so one way to come up with new things is to think about people who don't exist yet. And then that's one way to push the limits.
Yeah. Or it's that like our current problems are so frustrating. It's helpful to imagine future problems and situations and then try that. And then you can't be wrong because it hasn't happened yet, or it may never happen.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I interviewed a while ago. I interviewed Anthony Dunn, who wrote the book Speculative Everything. He's like a very famous educator in the kind of speculative design space. And I think they also had a project where, I need to double check it, but they had a project where they also thought about the future where people got used to eating plastic or something like that. It's kind of microplastics.
Or people we become able to digest them.
Yeah,
basically.
Being able to digest plastics. And I think it was like a part of speculative everything. And it's not really related to survival. It's kind of a survival skill, but not in the way that we think about it now.
Yeah. I love those fun ideas, though. Like when I was taking that class with Jessica Charlesworth, she brought up this idea that someone had where in order to mitigate the climate crisis, we should start to try to become smaller.
Smaller people physically?
In order to reduce our carbon footprint, which is a ridiculous concept that wouldn't really work, but it's fun to think about.
Yeah.
I think I was just saying, I've read that article about like how being short is actually like a moral, just really very moral and good for the environment. Yeah.
Yeah. Shout out to the short kings.
Yeah. Not taking up too much space, resources, anything. Yeah. I think it's very very humble, noble. But yeah, on the object guardian piece that you talked about, I like that they chose something that's really near and dear to my heart, like the idea of taking the 100 objects that Neil McGregor named. So he's like the director of the British Museum. I don't know if he is anymore, but he turned this book into a podcast that I like consumed voraciously. I was in a really boring job site at the time, and I had to do these long checklists. So I have that very wrapped into my head as like listening to each episode of 100 objects. And it's like, you know, a Ming vase and like going back very early, like a chipping axe from the Paleolithic era. The idea you could fit them all in a crate is not possible, but that's where the speculative part comes in. But the idea of like maintaining human knowledge is, I think, a really high-minded part of prepping. You had mentioned in our docket that you can download all of Wikipedia onto one flash drive. I love that. It does require a whole like system in order to get that information out of there, if you think about it.
It's not as hard as it sounds, though, because there's a Wikipedia link, which we'll link in the show notes, where they have a page to like help people do that. So it's, searching it would be hard, but it's not too hard to download.
But you'll need to always have a computer to access it and a power supply and like all these other things. But you can at least save the like, you know, the encoding of the data. It kind of reminds me of, I saw Mad Max Furiosa, and they have this character who's an old man, and he has all this information tattooed onto him, and he's wearing clothes that have more information written on them, and then he has, on top of that, all these things memorized. And I think they call him like a bookman or something, and you just become this human like depository of information. I don't know. I think that's really cool.
Yeah. They do the same thing in Waterworld, which was inspired by Mad Max.
Oh, yeah.
Where there's the like tattoo of a map on a child's back. That's like a major plot point.
Oh, yeah. But yeah, go listen to the 100 Items podcast. It's really good.
And then the next podcast we're going to get into, I don't actually really recommend listeners listen to. So it's the Casual Preppers podcast. I'm sorry I had you both listen to it. I didn't even like it.
I didn't listen, actually. I just read your notes.
Yeah. I just wanted to get into their head. I wanted to hear like an insider's perspective on preppers and prepper culture, because I'm new to this and I'm not going to be listening to them again, but it was very insightful. I guess the main thing I didn't like was just that they constantly code switch between like conventional non-accented English and like a vaguely rural accent to be funny, which I wouldn't mind if that was how they spoke all the time, but like it's very distracting from the ideas they're talking about.
Do they do it as a bit or?
Yeah, it's just to be funny.
Interesting.
What did you think about the podcast, Anna?
Yeah, I thought they were trying to make it funny and engaging, but I don't know. I felt like the episode about, you know, how they got into the hobby, and the episode about why they are just generally interested in survivalism, what's so exciting about it on a personal level and on a maybe like, I don't know, not a political level, but just kind of how they view it. I think what was interesting about this episode was really the perspective where they share that they have a lot of hope of like community coming together, like their local community coming together. And also it was pretty funny that they were all both super excited about the end of everyday, like stresses of the everyday life, the end of work. They were like, oh, we're not going to go to the office then. And I think it's also, again, really connected to the idea of like a coping mechanism, because I think the excitement really comes from having just one goal and being able to be useful and like protect the family. So yeah, that's what I took from that episode.
It's, I don't know, like, don't they know about retirement? You know, like, we don't need an apocalypse to stop work. Like, the idea is retirement. But maybe America's in such a rough financial spot that the end of the world seems more likely than sustainable retirement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, they seem to, I guess, gathering from this, like I think they really do want, whether they say it or not, they would like the world to end. They would like this to all be for something. They can always, I think, wave away and say like, oh no, I don't want anything bad to happen. I just want to be ready in case it does, which, I mean, you know, hope for the best, prepare for the worst kind of thinking. But I think it's also like there's a certain type of unexceptional man that's hoping for an exceptional time that's going to transform him into an exceptional man. You know, I just don't see, like, these guys are hoping for some terrible situation that's going to bring everyone together. And it's like, have you been to like a local government meeting? Like, you can go to that. Like, you don't need to wait for the world to end for people to come together. Like, have you volunteered at a local garden or like an old people's home? Like, I hope that, I don't know, not that I do those things either. I should say I'm like not an amazingly civic citizen, but I don't know. People are just waiting for the apocalypse instead of actually getting involved in like actual people's lives around them.
Yeah, I mean, they do say it in the episode that Anna and I listened to, Why We Love the Apocalypse. I'll link that one in the show notes. Like, they talk about how the idea of the apocalypse gives them like a warm, Christmassy feeling because they think it's an opportunity to come together with their friends and family. And it's going to be like, you know, Christmas Eve every day, basically. But no, they do acknowledge that it's going to be much worse than they imagine. It's just like fun to think about for a bunch of different reasons.
Yeah. I don't know, any illusions I had of the apocalypse being fun definitely faded away in COVID when I realized like, oh, this means you just can't like do things. And I realized that like, I don't know, like everything just, nothing was fun anymore. Like I can't imagine if this was like actually like truly apocalyptic.
Yeah. But yeah, the guys on this podcast, they kind of remind me of the conservative guy afraid of cities meme, which I think comes across just because at the beginning of every episode, it seems they'll just very briefly talk about things in the news that would freak out rural people. Like they'll just be like, oh yeah, there's riots in this place, or like, yeah, they just burnt down this over there. Like in one of the episodes they listened, they talked about how there were floods in the Brazilian state of Rio Grande do Sul, which happened pretty recently, but they were like using that as an example of like, see, this is why you should be ready. It was still good to get their perspective because like they said things that I would not have trusted if I just read like an outside observer saying it about them. Like on that episode about how they like the idea of the apocalypse, like they did bring up how like if they were ever to be in an apocalypse, and this is, I'm largely quoting them word for word, they said that it might improve like people's like preppers' economic position in relation to others, and that they might move up in economic status. And they said that you might move up in living condition relative to other people who might be higher class than you, but because they haven't been prepared like you, now you can be one of the top dogs in society instead of just the people who are good at picking stocks.
Yeah. It definitely feels like they're upset at the current hierarchy that feels unnatural. You know, they're like hearkening for if you were just the biggest, strongest, sharpest, then that would be rewarded through material gains. But now, yeah, I like what they say about picking stocks, like like the true determinants of success. Like, I mean, even just a few decades ago, like labor did matter more, but we live in, you know, an era of capital, and it's just about like, you know, what bank accounts are connected to your family name and stuff. Not to be a complete doomer about it, but like that stuff has become more and more important, and it feels like social hierarchies are more and more calcified. So just as they can't visualize retirement, they can't visualize any kind of like raising up a social generation where that used to be promised in America as a given thing, that you would live in a higher social caste than your parents. They're just waiting for the world to end so that they can like kill a pencil-necked accountant basically and take his stuff, which sounds terrible. And this is maybe unfair to them, but that line of thinking really reminded me of the movie Zone of Interest, which was that Holocaust movie that came out last year, right?
I didn't see it.
Yeah, and I don't know. I don't like watching Holocaust movies, but there is a scene that sticks out to me where like this German family that's living very well because like the husband, who was of, you know, lower middle class means, has really risen the ranks, and he's, you know, now commanding a concentration camp. And so this family lives very good. And so this woman reminisces with her mother about like, oh yeah, how good it was to see the Jewish families kicked out and stuff, where like these people who were only protected by essentially like laws and social mores were now no longer protected by those. And so everyone could just take their stuff. Kind of sounds like what these guys are waiting for like the social mores to break down so they can take other people's stuff.
No, I think it's a little bit less antagonistic than that. I think it's like they want to be valuable in society for having these skills. Like they imagine themselves sort of having more social connections post-collapse than they do in the present day. They think this will bring them together with friends too and people in their community. But there is this sort of like paradox that's interesting where most preppers, it's a big part of their identity. It's like their subculture, but they don't necessarily introduce themselves to that or let people in their communities know because they don't want to be the house people go to in like an SHTF scenario. They only want their family or people closest to them to know that they're prepared in these ways.
Yeah. They're all a little in the closet about it. It's interesting.
Yeah. Like actually on Strong Towns, which is the podcast, or sorry, on Upzoned, which is the Strong Towns podcast, Chuck Marone, the founder of Strong Towns, on one of the episodes, he was talking with Abby, and Abby brought up like, oh yeah, like, you know, you keep gas in your home at all times in case there's another gas crisis. And he got really uncomfortable and he was like, I've said that before. And it's like, they don't want people to know.
Yeah. The general preparedness. Like you don't want to brag about it too much. I guess that's why they want to find other preppers, because all these preppers must think that they're the most prepared. So why do I even need to know that guy has stuff? I have all the stuff. They don't want to hang out with normies like us because they see us as hangers on. Yeah. Interesting.
Do you have any other thoughts on the podcast, Anna?
No, I think you're right. And I think the kind of upward mobility of you know, that is offered when something really bad happens, I think that was definitely a big highlight for me as well.
Yeah. And then one more thing about their podcast is it's sponsored by this company called BattleBox, which is like a subscription box service where like monthly they'll send a box to your house filled with hand-picked outdoor survival EDC and other cool gear from their expert team of outdoor professionals. And they send you a free knife with the first box, which I think just for me as an outsider is like, I bet all those free knives they're giving out are never going to be used.
Yeah, those guys who are getting a free knife from a service already probably own a lot of knives. They're probably knife guys, you know?
Yeah.
Those services were always suspect to me. I had some friends who got into them. It was just like more video game oriented ones, I'd say. Ones are like, I think there was one called Loot Box. I want to say they must have like trademarked it, and you just get like a Legend of Zelda poster and you'd get like a little, you know, paperweight or something.
Yeah.
And I just think that they're so greedy. They're just companies like are too impatient to wait for you to want to buy things. So they just want you to sign up for the concept of getting things every month. And then you just get things that you objectively do not need because you didn't know that you're getting them. Maybe people aren't receiving enough gifts from friends or something where they need to pay a corporation to surprise them with gifts.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's definitely a consumerist angle to prepping.
Yeah. And it's nice to look at BattleBox's website because you can see the spectrum of consumer goods that are created for this subculture. And you can sort of like tease out some of the aesthetics that they're using to market themselves. And they sort of tap into like military and army stuff, also like hunting aesthetics, but there's also a fair amount of humor too. You'll see this here and there where like it's a little bit campy.
Yeah, it's like a little bit of gallows humor, you know, like joking about the end of the world stuff. I guess to kind of keep it light and to kind of, I think it's also like, it feels like you're in on the joke a little bit. Like everyone else out there is sheeple, but you and this like group of, you know, manufacturers and consumers are all like, oh, but we know what you really need in the apocalypse. Yeah, you brought up that they suggest that people should get like e-bikes and e-scooters. And I think that's interesting because, yeah, it sounds like a liberal thing, like bikes, like they're becoming cyclists as opposed to being car drivers. And so it's interesting to see like, okay, how can they sell this to their listener base? And they do it through saying like, oh, these aren't reliant on gas and stuff, which supply lines might become tight and you can charge it with a solar panel or something.
Yeah, so this is something I heard on an episode of the Casual Preppers podcast. This isn't something on BattleBox. But yeah, on that podcast, I heard them mention like you should have like an e-bike or an e-scooter in case of a SCHTF scenario so that you can get around. And then later on in the episode, I think they brought up how you should get vaccinated now. Both of these things are liberal coded, e-bikes and vaccines. And the fact that they're convincing people to do these things, buy these things, it's like, this is all just like an exercise in consumerism, I think.
Yeah, it's the one thing that can bridge the political gap. Yeah, it's just interesting when the same things can be sold two different ways. On the e-bikes thing, like I've seen just in Facebook ads like Quiet Cat e-bikes, and these are e-bikes for hunters. You can buy an attachment to hold your bow on it and your rifle and all that, and all the bikes come in like realistic camo colors. And it's like, their names are like the apex, because you're an apex predator and you're hunting down animals. And then the other side of that, like an identical performance-wise thing, is the company Turn, which made like commuter folding bikes and then pivoted to e-bikes. They have a new bike called the Aurochs, which name comes from like the oryx, an antelope, and that's like a prey animal. That's not a predator animal. And they sell it as a family-friendly adventure bike. And it seems like I bought an e-bike recently, so I've like learned about the products and stuff. It seems like an infinitely better thing for anything, let alone like hunting. But it's being sold in this more REI coded as opposed to Bass Pro Shops coded way. It's just interesting. They should be these very similar products, but they have to be like retooled for different audiences.
Yeah, and I think I think there is definitely a big difference between like a subculture like that and some of the like TikTok aesthetics and stuff like that, because I feel like for subculture, and preppers definitely have that, they have like a shared like mythology of, as you mentioned, just reading the news and seeing confirmation of their beliefs that they are getting ready for something really impactful. And I think a lot of aesthetics that, like cottagecore, it's not necessarily super connected, but it's kind of adjacent, but it doesn't necessarily have this mythology, and it's more like about visual attributes and stuff like that.
Yeah, because I think that internet subcultures all tie into the idea of the look, where I think like pre-internet subcultures, you could have different aspects of your life outside of your appearance that were countercultural, like whether it be skateboarding or riding on motorcycles, or like hippies lived in communes. There were things outside of just how you dressed, but now I think it's all about how you dress.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
I think we let subcultures like do their thing enough until they produce an aesthetic product that we can then bundle and exchange and sell. Like we as a culture let hippies go, and they lived in communes, and then eventually they started to, like, the way that they lived kind of functionally informed how they dressed. And then once that ball starts rolling, it's no longer about function. It's just, people exchange clothes and looks, and then you have an aesthetic building, and then you can bundle it and take it off on its way, and you no longer need the original culture that imported it. And then eventually it loses its relevance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, Anna, when you were looking at BattleBox, did you notice anything else about their consumer products or their aesthetic?
No, not really. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think you kind of described it really accurately.
Yeah. I mean, I think in one way, this is a great idea, because I feel like this type of man is like the hardest person to shop for. They're like the type of guy where you ask their like girlfriend or their wife or whatever, and you're like, what do I get them? And they're like, I have no idea.
Yeah.
Like, I would probably only think to give them like tools or gift cards or underwear or socks. And so this gave me so many ideas. Like, this is what guys want, I guess.
Yeah. But the problem is that if they're really gear-brained guys, there used to be some good term for that. I forget what it is, but like they probably already have the stuff they like. If they're really into knives, you'd think that they love their knives. They don't want another one. They've done research into those ones. So I think these guys might be a little trickier than you think.
There is also the subscription service for most of the men. It's called Lot Systems, and it was founded by a guy who worked for Airbnb and kind of led their R&D efforts around prefab housing. So he had this subscription service, and it's also like a combination of tools and not necessarily survivalist accessories, but like kind of menswear that is very austere and very polished. And I felt like, I think it's another good example of kind of trying to create like a very prescriptive, cultish set of,
This is what we
things that
dress
you can
like.
use and tools. Yeah. And,
This is our uniform.
but it's a little bit, it's about a certain lifestyle and a certain vision, but it doesn't have like a mythology like preppers.
Yeah. I think that maybe this is more of a certain genre of prepper, the more like anti-government prepper, you could say, in a way. They really do have a shared mythology there. I was joking with our friend Patrick in our Discord. He said something about like Ruby Ridge, which was this big like flashpoint moment for anti-government like militia type guys. And I realized like, oh, I knew that reference and all that. But there's lots of other things like that are part of the shared history of that kind of type of person. They have these flashpoint moments that show cracks in the ability of government to take care of people. And so these become part of the mythology of prepping. Since we've never had a full apocalypse, we've had these things that have come close. And so they're held up and their stories are told and they're kind of used as like parables of like, this was close. If it was just a bit further, then everything would have been terrible and everyone would have needed us. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one thing that type of guy gets wrong is that for preppers, I think that the fantasy of having civilization and is partly a fantasy of having urban life end. It's a way to sort of say that all along, that like cities were unsustainable and there's something unnatural about it. Mm-hmm. And I, as a rural person, live in nature and I'm closer to it. And my survival is intrinsically good. But I think that they're kind of wrong in thinking that like cities are doomed to fail, in the sense that like cities outlive countries and nations and cultures even. The city of Rome has continuously been occupied for over 2,000 years. And like, yes, it fell from its ancient Roman high of 1 million people to 30,000 in the Middle Ages, but it has over 1 million people again today. And it's the Lindy effect. And I think there is some truth to thinking that like the infrastructure that ancient cities built for themselves was sturdier in a sense, like the ancient Roman aqueducts in ancient Rome could bring water into the city that like I'm sure a modern system would fail after a while a lot sooner. But yeah, I do think that it's very safe to say that like as long as humanity exists, cities like Chicago, New York, London, they'll survive. There's lots of examples like that.
There's so much like inertia to them. I will give them some credit that like when you look back at Paleolithic like civilizations, we can now see that like some places would develop agriculture and denser settlements and then stop as well. Because it's not a linear, like if you ever played the game Civilization, it's not a straight tree of just acquiring new skills that you add to your civilization. Sometimes like city building and agriculture is just a response to environmental concerns. And so if those environmental things change, people might just go back to hunting and gathering. Things can go back and forth, but we've hit a certain amount of inertia now. We're not going back to hunting and gathering. Like we've tasted the forbidden fruit of agriculture and city development. Like we're not going to go all be individual homesteaders.
Yeah. I mean, our potential, like the carrying capacity for humans, if society fails, is so much lower than it used to be. Because there's this crazy statistic where I think the biomass of all mammals on the planet Earth, 97% of it is humans and our livestock. Only 3% of it is wildlife. And so if society fails, how many people do you think can subsist off that 3%?
Yeah.
like very little.
There's not enough white-tailed deer to go around if you take out all the beef that people eat in a year. Like it's not a 1-for-1 replacement. There's not enough wild game. Like we've grown the human population so much and we've squeezed out the wild population. It just kind of makes sense.
Yeah. Speaking of Lindy City, San Francisco, I think, is one of those places.
Too beautiful not to exist. Climate wise, like people will just, if it gets flattened in a nuclear apocalypse, like once the cloud fades, people will return to the Bay Area and be like, this is great.
Yeah. Yeah. How long have you lived in the Bay Area for?
Almost 7 years. Yeah. But yes, there is also it doesn't have to go into the show. When you guys were talking about department stores, I was reading something about like Oakland and geology of Oakland and there was like a section about department stores that kind of defined Oakland as like an independent city that is different from, like, very distinctive from San Francisco.
Wow. It's one of those things of like consumer culture determining a citizenship culture of like people felt more identified with their department stores than they felt with their local government, which is fair. Which one has more involvement in your daily lives? But they kind of reverse engineered that into a city feeling of like, I don't know. I think that's why like functioning commercial corridors are so important. Like I live next to like a very well functioning commercial corridor, and I feel like I have more tie to that than any like neighborhood name. I live in a neighborhood called Lakeview, but I feel like, oh yeah, I live on Broadway. Like that's much more tangible to me.
Yeah, I guess I feel more connected to the major street I live off than my neighborhood too, actually. Because I feel like the major street, I live in Avondale. I'll just say it, whatever. I live off Milwaukee Avenue, which like tons of people do too. It's not a big deal. But yeah, like Avondale itself is kind of lame. Honestly, it's gotten really cool recently.
It's got a big highway running through it, which is always going to kind of kneecap its like cool factor.
Yeah, but I feel like the only like beautiful, truly beautiful part of Avondale is off this one street. So I think there's credence to what you're saying.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. But yeah, I love San Francisco personally. But so for you, with your interest in preppers, like it seems like you know a lot more about like the sort of like tech side of preppers. And could you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, totally. I think it's very interesting because typically also there were some news about Peter Thiel also building some kind of prepper survivalist estate in New Zealand or something like that. So I think, and Peter Thiel just generally being interested in supporting different media outlets or destroying different media outlets.
According to his own whims that day.
Yes. I think in San Francisco, it's definitely, there is no rural part of it. It's very, it's all about kind of tech elites and certain ideologies that kind of surround like Peter Thiel or Elon Musk. So I think it's very, very different from probably 99% of preppers around the US.
Yeah. I had first thought about that angle from this 2017 New Yorker piece, Doomsday Prep for the Super Rich. And it goes into people spending bajillions on bunkers and stuff and having just like, you know, a private plane fueled up and ready to go. And I think it's a testament to like just how good the lives of the tech super rich are, that like the thought of anything ending that, like they have enough capital that like even if they made a few bad stock picks, they never have to work again. And so once that's solved, they need to then, as we kind of mentioned earlier, they need to create a new problem to solve. Like they need to be like, all right, what could take away my wealth and my means from me? And the answer is, you know, nuclear apocalypse or societal collapse. And so they then go about insulating themselves from that, which I think is a natural impulse. Like,
yeah. Like, do both of you, you think that like the fears that the like billionaire tech preppers have, do you think they're envisioning like a different apocalypse than other prepper groups?
I'm not quite sure. I think it's not a specific scenarios that people have in mind. I feel like same with like space travel or Mars exploration and stuff like that. I think it's more of like an extra layer of protection, but the source of danger is kind of ambient and unknown. And there are a lot of methods people are kind of employing when they are thinking about protecting themselves in case of disaster. I think space travel also falls under this category because I think and also kind of Brian Johnson and people who are so obsessed with longevity. I think it's three different variations of what people can get into when they have all the resources and also have a lot of like anxiety about protecting themselves or planning for the worst. So I definitely see a lot of parallels between like Brian Johnson and people who are like talking about how space travel is going to be absolutely critical. And Yeah, and
Yeah, I think
and all those things.
there's like a transhumanist space travel doomsday prep kind of like industrial complex. It feels of all these things are like reckoning with the fact that like our time on Earth is finite, our Earth's habitability is finite, and like our society is finite, basically. And so that's like how we approach each of these issues. In the New Yorker article, they talk about this thing that we kind of talked about in our in the Great Lakes. What was that article? What was that episode called? I want to call it Great Lakes Supremacy.
The Fresh Coast.
Fresh Coast. There you go. But our friend David was talking about like the kind of collapse of a faith-based or a trust-based society, and that's like I think that these tech people kind of know that they have a fragile situation that like it's all built on trust. The governments allow them to exist with all these hordes of money, and so I think that they try and harden their actual protection. The first step is, of course, you get a bodyguard. That is just a very elemental thing. But then you wonder, like, what can you do beyond that? I'm just surprised they don't have like, personal armies at this point. But that's I don't want to give them any ideas.
I'm glad they don't have a standing army. For me personally, I don't like Musk. I don't like SpaceX. Space exploration, not interesting to me personally. But I do think that Brian Johnson, I kind of get what he's going for personally. I don't think it's like, people find him really disturbing, I think, because most people think it's wrong not to die. But I guess for me, I'm Catholic, and I think that like most people assume that it goes against like God's will to try to obtain immortality. I can kind of see that, but at the same time, we are also tasked with like, trying to survive and stay alive at all costs. And I don't see it as being as wrong as other people do, I think.
It's an angle of being like, I don't know, you can't say pro-life because that's a charged phrase.
Yeah,
but
I was
like,
avoiding saying that.
Yeah. But I can tell that you're like weaving around it of like, I'm a very big fan of life is what you could say, I guess.
Yeah,
and I want to keep
life.
it going if it's quality. Yeah, exactly. I understand that. Yeah. I think we're kind of getting there.
Yeah. Any final takes on preppers before we kind of wrap up? Okay, well, on that existential note, this was a really cool topic. I think that, again, it's a good companion to our nuclear energy discourse episode, because all of these fears that we're talking about around nuclear apocalypse have led to so many other things, and like all of these other little subcultures for preppers and survivalists that have emerged with all this fear. And thank you for coming on today, Anna. You're our second ever virtual guest, and we loved looking through your zine and all of the articles you published on bunkers.
Thank you so much.
All right, bye.
Bye everyone.
Awesome.
Thank you.